say that this is all part of our kind of kicking off our Asian Studies program, and we're all very happy with that. And along that line, we are very happy to have our special guest today, Professor On-Cho Ng, Professor of History, Religious Studies, and Asian Studies at Penn State at the main campus. Professor Ng went to school in Hong Kong and then received his Ph.D. at the University of Hawaii. He will be speaking tonight on the Confucian Come-back, Tradition, Modernity, and Ideology in Contemporary China.
Thank you. Thank you. So, happy Chinese New Year again. Happy Year of the Tiger, actually. So may your roar be strong and clear in the coming year. I heard that you have successfully ushered in an Asian Studies program. So as an Asian scholar, I'm always heartened that an institution actually is putting resources into developing Asian studies. So hopefully, you bring more Asian studies scholars on campus and talk about various aspects of Asia. Of course, today I'll be talking about China. Now, I do different things in my research. I'm by training a historian, but because I work on Confucianism, I also deal with religion. I very much also deal with philosophy, and in fact I edit actually a philosophy journal. So I'm going to do two things today. I'm going to talk about a recent historical phenomenon, namely the revival of Confucianism in the last 20, 30 years or so in mainland China. Truly remarkable phenomenon. In the second part of the talk, I'll be behaving like a philosopher. And I'd like to think together with you about the ethical possibilities, the ethical potentials of Confucianism in the 21st century world. I'd like to think about whether Confucianism is a potential contributor to, let's say, a global ethic of some sort. All right? Now first, what is Confucianism? Well, Confucianism, briefly stated, is a social ethic. It is a political ideology. It is also a philosophical and religious worldview. As a social ethic, it really presumes that society is a sort of organic whole, constituted by individuals that are, you might say, born into obligations. Essentially, society is conceived as a kind of field of relationships. So whereas in the modern West, every individual, everyone is born free. Free individual, right? Everyone is born free. In the Confucian case, in social ethical terms, you might say that everyone is born into a field of relationships, therefore everyone is born with obligations, right? As a political ideology, Confucianism essentially presumes that the state is a family writ large. So essentially, you're really talking about the presumed benevolence of the ruler working on behalf of the people, so appeasement of the people, taking care of the welfare and benefits and happiness of the people would be the supreme goal of this paternalistic ruler. Now, as a religious philosophical worldview, Confucianism is a systematic explanation of the workings of the cosmos and humanity. So you might say that Confucianism essentially advances a holistic view of the universe, wherein ultimately heaven, earth, and humanity are one. So this is also quite different from the modern Western mind. In the modern Western conception of the world, there is a clear distinction between nature and humanity. Humanity uses its rationality to dissect, analyze nature. Humanity controls nature, harnesses nature, so as to bring about a good life for humanity. But on the other hand, Confucianism presumes the ultimate oneness of heaven, earth, and humanity. So, very briefly, this is what Confucianism is all about. And of course, you spend years and years and study the details of these broad generalizations. Now, before I talk about the revival of Confucianism the last 20, 30 years or so in China, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on what Confucianism has played, what sort of roles Confucianism has played in, let's say, the modern period. How has it been used? Well, Confucianism has always been an academic subject, I suppose, and in some ways a museum piece. So you study it, if you are a historian, a philosopher, it's certainly a subject of antiquarian and academic interest. So you might say that, beginning with the Jesuits, actually, Confucianism has always been, a darling subject, for academic studies. Yeah? So you might say that in the 20th century, at least, Confucianism has been sort of museumized, studied, appreciated, put on a pedestal as a many-splendid thing, Now, but for the Chinese, the situation is more complicated. From the 19th century on, basically Confucianism would be viewed by many, the Chinese themselves, as an impediment to modernization. So in other words, Confucianism furnished a sort of cultural explanation as to why China was not competitive, why China actually fell victim to Western imperialism, a kind of subcolonialism, that sort of thing. So Confucianism, especially in the early part of the 20th century, was subjected to severe criticism from the May 4th movement onward. 1919 was supposedly the beginning of the so-called May 4th movement, new culture movement, where we saw a good deal of iconoclastic criticism of Chinese culture. And what is Chinese culture? Well, according to these radical critics, Chinese culture is Confucianism, and is backward, feudal, an obstacle to modernization. So in the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 76, the anti-Confucius campaign certainly was one of the major components of this so-called Cultural Revolution. So you have revolutionized China by demolishing essentially Confucian culture, Confucian practices. Now, after 1949, there was a group of Chinese who moved to Hong Kong with the fall of mainland China into the hands of the communists. They moved to Hong Kong and established a college called New Asia College. Now, this New Asia College was supposed to be the site where old Chinese culture would be preserved. In particular, they're talking about preserving the Confucian heritage. So in other words, Confucianism actually to some Chinese, especially after 1949, represented the encapsulation of Chinese culture. We must preserve it. We must bide our time and wait for the end of communism so that Confucianism could come back, you know. This group of Chinese scholars eventually came to be known as the New Confucians. The major goal actually would be to preserve Confucianism. And in so doing, they are preserving the cultural memory of China as far as they're concerned. You know? So they set up shop in Hong Kong, British colony, right on the fringe of China proper. The goal is always not to forget the real Chinese culture. Right? Now, beginning in the late 1970s, after the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, with the death of Mao Zedong, a lot of scholars began to look at Confucianism differently. They looked at the remarkable economic success of Japan, followed by Hong Kong, and then Taiwan, Singapore, and then South Korea. These Asian tigers, you know, these dynamic economic powers. What enabled them to do so? Well, so from the late 70s on through the 1980s, there was this theory that, all these countries were able to embark on these remarkable economic growths and developments largely because all of them shared a Confucian cultural heritage. So in other words, in the 1980s, there was a kind of Chinese version of Max Weber's thesis. Of course, some of you know Max Weber in the early 20th century propounded the thesis that there is this causal relationship between Protestant ethics and capitalism. So what the Chinese scholars did was, hey, there is a causal linkage between Confucian values, Confucian ethics, and economic development. Well, how so? Well, because Confucianism values hard work, frugality, it emphasizes education, it calls for the sacrifice of individual good for collective good and all that sort of thing. So obviously there is a supreme irony here, you know. In the early part of the 20th century, through the Cultural Revolution, Confucianism would be regarded as the obstacle or impediment against economic development growth. But now, in the 1980s, Confucianism was a great thing. It was actually the cultural engine of economic development. Right? So there's another role that Confucianism has been playing. Once upon a time, it was the obstacle against changes. Now, actually, is an engine of good change. Now, also, Confucianism, in recent years, has played another role, and that is, it plays the role of a post-colonial discourse, essentially. In other words, Confucianism poses, according to some theorists, as a countervailing force against globalization. In this post-colonial world, Confucianism represents a sort of native value system. Now, we're no longer beholden to colonial values. Of course, in the days of colonialism, imperialism, Western values were appropriated, sometimes voluntarily, most of the time not. So this post-colonial discourse essentially asserts the independence of Asian values. And then Confucianism would be a perfect example of a sort of core Asian value, you know. So this post-colonial discourse essentially expresses a certain dissatisfaction with globalization. Globalization, of course, very often can be construed simply as Americanization. It could be construed simply as a form of Eurocentrism. See? So these are some of the things that Confucianism have been doing in the modern period, shall we say. So it has been playing different roles, served different function. Now, what happened in China? Unquestionably, from the 1980s onward, Confucianism enjoyed a great revival. It's part and parcel of this general phenomenon that the Chinese themselves describe as a culture fever. You know, by culture they mean, you know, the humanities, music, arts, and that sort of thing, you know, religion, you know. So, from the 1980s onwards, the Chinese themselves had this great hankering after old Chinese culture, old Chinese cultural artifacts, and that sort of thing, okay? For instance, in the decades of the 1980s alone, more than 1,000 articles were published on Confucianism. 1984, a Confucian Foundation was established on the occasion of the 2,535th birthday of Confucius. So this Confucian Foundation was established in the hometown of Confucius in Shandong province. And the statue of Confucius, which was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, was restored. So it's part of the celebration of the opening of this Confucian Foundation. And in 1985, the Confucius Research Institute was established and was located in the former imperial temple dedicated to Confucius, not far from the Forbidden City in Beijing. And then in 1989, the 2,540th birthday of Confucius was celebrated by a huge international conference, jointly organized by the UNESCO and the Chinese Confucian Foundation. And of course, if you become rich and famous, you gotta have a stamp. So Confucius finally had a stamp. So in 1990, a commemorative stamp in honor of Confucius was issued in China. So once reviled, Confucius actually is now renowned and honored. You can buy a beer named after Confucius. A lot of Confucius named Confucius restaurant. 孔家店, at one time in the May 4th movement, refers to essentially, you know, backward practices, oppression, subjugation of women. But no, now the term is good, it's chic, it's voguish, you know. You may have a hard time finding a little red book, you know, there's quotations of Mao Zedong in many bookstores. You have no problems at all picking up the Analects, you know, the 论语, containing the gems of words of Confucius, yeah? So there's no question that Confucius now is basking in newfound popularity, you know? And indeed, if you go to any bookstore at all, you find tons of books and DVDs on Confucianism, Chinese translations of Western studies of Confucianism too, tons of them, everywhere. And in fact, some of the Chinese philosophers and scholars who were trained in Marxism, many of them actually now have switched over to Confucian studies. Why not, you know? Many universities actually now offer courses on Confucian studies. Now that's not surprising, of course. Why shouldn't universities offer courses in Confucian studies? Of course, but many of these courses actually are designed for business people. Peking University, right? Or Beijing University actually offers a 12-month program in Confucian studies for business people at a cost of some $5,000 US, which is a huge amount. So can you imagine paying $5,000 on a course on Confucius? You know? Now, about 18 universities or so all over the country offer courses on Confucianism. Many of them actually have set up institutes dedicated to Confucian studies. In fact, there are tons and tons of conferences and meetings all over China every year. So I'm always invited to go to many of these conferences. At the beginning, it was nice and fun, hey, a rarity. It's good. But now, every year, at least 5 or 6 invitations to some of these conferences. So there's no question that there is a huge revival. Now, there are 2 events in recent years, few years, that truly crystallized this phenomenon of the Confucian Come-back. The first event occurred in October 2006. And what is this event? A television event. This television program is called Lecture Room. So it's basically a television educational program. In October 2006, there is this photogenic, charismatic Chinese communications scholar by the name of Yu Dan. She was 41 years old then, really not a scholar specializing in Confucianism at all. But for a week, she basically talked about Confucius and his ideas. And then it garnered huge and huge ratings. We're talking about millions and millions of viewers. Basically, she put the analects of Confucius into very simple words. She would give her own insights into Confucius's ideas. Essentially, she was selling Confucius as a sort of self-help guru. Maybe in some ways, she presents herself as a life coach using Confucius's ideas. It became an immense hit. And in fact, a book, a very slim volume, based on the television program. So millions and millions of copies. Certainly greatly outsold Harry Potter's books, let's put it this way. Now she's rich and famous. Yu Dan. So this is really a pivotal sort of event, highly symbolic event, that a program on the analects on Confucius could be such a great hit, generating a multi-million bestseller. A year later came another pivotal event, October 2007. The plenary session of the Communist Party's Central Committee formally endorsed President Hu Jintao's call for the creation of, I quote, harmonious society. For the first time, the Communist Party used such language, the language of harmony. Of course, previous to that, the Communist Party, of course, used language concerning struggle. So that decision, that proclamation, confirmed the shift in the party's emphasis away from the idea that rapid economic growth itself is enough. In fact, rapid economic growth, rapid social changes generated a lot of problems. In fact, even according to official statistics, in the year 2005, there were no fewer than some 90,000 unrest amongst the farmers and factory workers. Now that's the official statistics. You bet that the unofficial would be much higher, right? So in other words, the government realizes that things are not entirely rosy, despite actually economic growth in the previous 25 years, 30 years or so, robust economic growth, double-digit growth every year. probably unprecedented in human history, lifting essentially 200 million people out of poverty. It's a major feat. Maybe unprecedented, as I said, in human history. But these growths and developments also generated problems, and now the government acknowledged it. And how do you confront it? Ideologically, philosophically, they resorted to Confucianism. So what are the reasons for the promotion and revival of Confucianism on the part of the Chinese government? Well, it beats Chinese following Christianity, for instance. Christian churches are doing actually quite well in China these days, actually, especially the Protestant churches. Even the so-called underground churches are beginning to emerge. And actually, it's fairly safe now, actually, to worship, even if you're not one of the officially endorsed churches. Catholicism is still problematic for obvious reasons, largely because, you know, the papacy and China does have a lot of problem with that ultimate, you know, theological allegiance must be owed to the papacy, you know. Well, if you want to give people something to think about philosophically, religiously, it's better to let them think about Confucianism as opposed to Christianity. And you must have heard of this sort of popular religious movement. The Falun Gong at one time was quite popular in China too, and it was of course suppressed. So there's no question that China is confronting a sort of ideological, spiritual vacuum. Communism is obviously dead. Maoism is obviously dead. Marxism is no longer in place. At the same time, you cannot claim that you are actually a capitalistic country. So where do you go? So it seems that this native Chinese philosophical system, Confucianism, fit the bill. It does the job, you know. So when you move from a rigid communist ideology to free market economy so quickly, there are problems, you know. And in some ways then, Confucianism would be perceived as a kind of cure for many of these ills. Now, because if you look at China today, what do you see? As far as many people are concerned, what you see actually is huge disparity between the rich and the poor. Great difference between the coastal areas and the dirt poor rural areas. On TV, you see stories about corruption, fake baby formulas, killing babies, shoddy construction, so that Sichuan earthquake collapsed high school buildings, elementary school buildings, you know, fake degrees, Ph.Ds, M.Ds, you know, everything is for sale, bogus medicine, you know. Yeah, there might be rapid growth, but what about morality? What about ethics? So Confucianism seems to fill this gap, this vacuum, you know. Moreover, China has been sort of playing a certain nationalistic card. Despite all the unrest, despite all the problems, actually, the Chinese government is quite popular, even amongst the youth. You'd be quite surprised to know if you do polling. So it's not going to fall anytime soon. Now, there are reasons why. I think this Chinese government, whatever its problems or weaknesses, actually has been quite successful in generating a sort of nationalistic pride through sports, through military built up, through economic successes, and that sort of thing. Now, if a nation is an imagined community, then Confucianism is a wellspring of imaginations. You know, you can claim that all Chinese, all over the world, actually have inherited the Confucian heritage. Of course, there is the Taiwan question, you know. So in other words, we are as Confucian as the Taiwanese, right? This is for a long time. The Taiwanese actually were also quite intent on preserving the so-called real Chinese culture, Confucianism being part of it. Okay. So in short, now almost a decade after Confucianism came under attack as an obstacle to development, it is now heralded, it is now praised, embraced as a solution to the many political, economic, and ethical problems that China faces. So essentially that explains why Confucianism has enjoyed this tremendous comeback. Now, but let's not be too optimistic about it. Certainly the Chinese government promoted, tolerated Confucian studies. But if you were to actually propose political changes, even along Confucian lines, you run into problems. In fact, your stuff will still be censored. Suppose you want to, reform the legislature, reform the political order in accordance with your understanding of Confucian political theory or ideas, you'll have some hard time getting your stuff published. A good friend of mine, Daniel Bell, a French-Canadian scholar who now actually teaches at Tsinghua University, probably like the MIT of China. He is actually extremely sympathetic to Confucianism, and in fact, the Chinese government likes his stuff quite a bit because, Bell touts the virtue of Confucianism, collective values, and that sort of thing. But some of his stuff actually has been yanked. He couldn't publish some of the writings concerning political reform, inspired by Confucian ideas. Right? So in other words, there's no question that the Chinese government's promotion of Confucianism today is very much driven by political motives, by self-interest, and no question about it. Now, this is the first part of the talk. What I want to do now is, as I said, think along with you about the ethical possibilities of Confucianism in the 20th century world. So in other words, if we can make sure that Confucianism is not manipulated or appropriated as a sort of blatant political tool, does it not have some use in the contemporary world, apart from a museum piece, being a museum piece, an academic subject? And I think yes. And I want to talk about the ethical possibilities of Confucianism in terms of human rights discourse. Largely because whatever you think about human rights discourse as a viable ethical discourse, I think there is, by and large, universal acceptance that human rights are important. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed in 1948, and there are a lot of signatories, including China then, not yet communist. So at least it's some kind of blueprint that everyone seems to be able to subscribe to in one way or another. Now, in 1993, on the occasion of the centennial meeting of the Parliament of the World's Religion in Chicago, the leaders of the various world's religions actually came up with a declaration. This declaration is called the Declaration Toward a Global Ethic. And there were Confucian representatives there too. Well, essentially this declaration sets out fundamental moral principles to which all religions may subscribe. And no surprise to many of us, much of this ethics actually concerns human rights. All right? So let's say something about human rights and its potential linkage with Confucianism. What are rights? Well, of course, the English word right is derived from the Latin word rectus, meaning straight. So the physical sense of straightness is extended to the moral realm to mean that which is correct or right. And in turn, the belief that I may do something because it is right is extended to the belief that I may do something because I have a right to do it, or I have a right to it. Now, in time, a right is seen as something personal to an individual. It is something that an individual has. So, a right holder is always in the position of being the beneficiary. There is always the subjective sense of entitlement. So I always say something like, by right, I am free. By right, I should be owed justice. Now, this notion of rights, of course, is also closely related to the notion of freedom. And in fact, in the West, the fundamental concept of humanity and human life is freedom. And that is, first and foremost, we are fundamentally free. Freedom is the basis of human rights. Freedom is the basis of democracy. Freedom is the basis of justice, choice, autonomy, individuality. In fact, U.S. foreign policy is justified as furthering freedom and its relative democracy. Right? Now, let's interrogate this notion of right and freedom. Now, in theory, everyone, no argument, everyone can agree that freedom with a predicate of rights, it's good. Right? You won't argue against that, right? It's good, right? Human rights is good. Freedom is good, right? You won't argue against that. But what about in practice? Now, in practice, the picture is not always that rosy. What good is the right to free speech if, to begin with, I'm not educated, so I can hardly articulate what I want to say? Yeah, I'm free to speak. Who is going to listen to me? In the first place, you won't be able to speak. What good is the right to free assembly if I'm too poor, too hungry, too sick because of lack of health care to travel? Yes, I may be free to say and do whatever within the limits of the law, but who will listen? And what possible impact and audience will I have? What is the value of the freedom to dispose of my property however I want, if, to begin with, I don't own anything? That is to say, freedom is only practically meaningful if there is a certain degree of wealth, education, property, and prosperity. Now, but what is the reality in the world, including the so-called free world? Well, the reality is this. I just heard it in PBS, NPR. The richest 20% of the world's population consume 86% of all the goods and services, while the poorest 20% consume about 1.5% of the world's goods and services. So, what is the value of the concept of freedom or rights for these poor folk? So my point is this. If we built a society solely or largely on the view of individuals as autonomous beings, then we tend to yield a society that is uncaring, or at least passive in trying to promote the well-being of others. If everyone is a free individual, I have no moral responsibility to see that your welfare is protected, improved, or guaranteed. I see no huge need to deal with the problem of unequal distribution of resources. Moreover, absolute notion of individual freedom and rights, with its sense of subjective entitlement, tends to breed a litigious society, because my individual rights must by all means be protected. Injury to my freedom must be avenged through lawsuits. So in other words, an individual, in terms of Western human rights discourse, is a beneficiary, in that one is entitled to one's rights. So what I'm saying is that if we simply see ourselves as fundamentally autonomous individuals, we tend not to see and understand others as co-members of a large human community. One tends to see oneself as a holder of rights. Now, what is the implication of this sort of stance, or this sort of conception of individuality? Well, I think it's a certain impact on ethical behavior or assumptions. The assumption is, I can do whatever I want as long as laws are not violated. Now, this sort of stance essentially is a kind of minimalist ethic. So in other words, human rights discourse risk degenerating into a kind of minimalist ethics. Now, in the words of the eminent moral philosopher Charles Taylor, that's what he said. I quote, "Instead of saying that it is wrong to kill me, we begin to say that I have a right to live." See the difference? Instead of saying that it is wrong to kill me, we begin to say that I have a right to live. So what Charles Taylor is complaining is that this sort of human rights discourse essentially does not pay enough attention to the moral, ethical elements of human living. Okay? I suppose in some ways I've described the sort of society in which we live. So, how does Confucianism come into the picture then? In what way can Confucianism perhaps complement and enrich this particular picture? Now, I said before, in terms of Confucianism, a human person, a human being, is one who is born into a web of relationships. The good life must be a social one. To be fully human is to be a part of society, to be always a co-member of a larger community. So the Confucian self is not a free, autonomous individual because I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a subject, I'm a citizen, I'm a husband, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm a brother, I'm a co-worker, I'm an employee, I'm an employer. In other words, no one is free from others. You are born into a certain social role, and you have to live these roles. Living those roles means fulfilling your natural social obligations and responsibilities as both beneficiaries and benefactors. So in other words, Confucianism assumes that no one can only be a beneficiary as a right holder. Everyone must also be the benefactor, because I am not free from others. Therefore, people are not incidental to my life. People are crucial in defining my own self, and by realizing my social roles, I achieve dignity, I achieve satisfaction, and I achieve meaning in life. In a word, the Confucian self is a relational self, unlike the individual self or the atomistic self that became essentially the paradigmatic notion of individuality in the modern West. Okay? So basically what I'm saying is, if you look at Confucianism as a philosophy, it seems to have something to contribute to the human rights discourse, which I still think should probably be the foundation of any global ethic that we hope to develop. Now, in so criticizing the human rights discourse, which really is a product of Western Enlightenment, I'm not saying that in the West people are uncaring. I'm not saying that human rights discourse will necessarily breed people who don't care about others. No, there are plenty of people who are charitable, who are compassionate, who see themselves essentially as benefactors, not just as beneficiaries. But the problem is this, though. All social, political, economic policies must begin with certain philosophical stances. And as long as your ideological or philosophical predicate is that everyone is a radically free individual, you will tend to produce social, political, economic policies that will reflect that stance. And that might leave something to be desired in terms of the fact that many of these policies do not adequately take into account that caring for others, that a sense of sociality, that's a sense of civility, is very much important ingredients of a full, flourishing human life. So I thank you for your attention. This is the end of my talk, so about less than an hour that was supposed to do. So thank you for your attention.
Perhaps Professor Ng could take some questions if you're willing to.
Yes, sure.
Field.
Have I convinced you that much? Hey, come and argue with me a little bit. You say, hey, you're full of it. I don't agree with you. Yeah.
Professor, thank you very much for your very interesting run through the past century, rapidly and carefully. Some American commentators have been commenting that as Confucianism arises, they're looking for China to close itself to the outside, as it has done in other periods when Confucianism was primary. Do you have a comment on that?
So China is trying to use Confucianism as a way to bolster its sense of wholeness so that it doesn't really have to deal with the outside world? Oh yeah, there's no question about it, yeah. Because in some ways, now look, the general criticism leveled against today's China is that China lacks human rights, right? So what is China's response? China's response is, hey, we have a different culture, we have a different history. We view individuality different. What you call human rights actually is not particularly applicable or meaningful to the Chinese, because we value collectivity much, much more. We'd like to follow the states, in other words, So there's no question that this kind of post-colonial discourse is a way of warding off criticisms. It's a way of going back into a kind of nationalistic cocoon. Just like, historians of Anderson's notion that nations are imagined communities, right? So how do you imagine yourself being actually related beings in this nation state? So what the Chinese is trying to say, look, we are related by dint of the fact that we subscribe to Confucian values, and these values are different from Western values. Hence, we are an independent nation. We are no longer beholden to Western values as we once were during the days of imperialism or subcolonialism. Yeah? So there's no question about it. It's a way for China, actually, to develop its sense of identity. Now, I mean, obviously, as a scholar myself, I'm highly critical about that. So essentially, I make no bones about the fact that the Chinese are clearly just simply politically, ideologically manipulating Confucianism. There's no question about it, you know. But at the same time, I'm heartened by the fact that the Chinese government is promoting Confucianism, because I'm hoping that in the process, in the long run, there will be changes. Once you actually allow this sort of discourse to prosper, perhaps that will actually enable the Chinese leaders to reflect on how un-Confucian they are. So in fact, they don't even understand what real Confucianism is. As I mentioned, if you try to develop the implications of Confucian political thinking, the Chinese government will stop you. They don't want you to do it, you know. So they simply rhetorically claim that, look, I mean, you know, the collectivity is important, that we're in this together, that we are a harmonious whole, you know. So therefore, human rights essentially is just an assertion of rampant individualism. Singapore actually has been doing that quite a bit too. Lee Kuan Yew, for instance, you know. Obviously, I wouldn't say a dictator, but at least certainly there was not true democracy in Singapore, even though there is a rule of law, and for many, many years. In fact, he was one of the Asian leaders who actively promoted Confucianism too. For those of us who study Confucianism and would know, is Taiwan scholars who for many years taught at Harvard, Du Weiming. In fact, he was hired by Lee Kuan Yew in the early 80s to go to Taiwan to develop a Confucian curriculum. And so Du Weiming actually faced a lot of fire as a result of that, you know, because you become an ideologue. You work for a government and try to develop certain values which are supposed to be propagated, so as to shore up the existing regime, so as not have to deal with, you know, Western democratic notions of human rights. Now, as I pointed out, our human rights discourse is not without problems. In fact, it has a lot of problems. So that's why we need to actually interrogate it too, even though we may accept that this should be the foundation for a lot of dialogues, you know. But I think human rights discourse alone, it's just not adequate. Well, that's why we still have philosophy departments. I mean, if you look at the ethical traditions, even in the West, you can point to a few right off the bat. The ancient Greek virtue ethic tradition, and then you have Cartesian, Kantian, deontology, the science of ethics, and then came the utilitarian ethics, and then you have American pragmatic, neo-pragmatic ethics, and then finally we have this, I barely can utter that because I loathe it, deconstructionist ethics. There's no such thing as deconstructionist ethics, right? But there's French theory ethics. So in other words, I mean, all these various ethical traditions offer something different. And what I'm saying is that even in the West, we're still, I wouldn't say going around in a circle, but at least we're still looking for various resources from different sources so as to bolster what we regard as a good way of life, generally described in terms of a democracy, generally described in terms of human rights discourse. Yeah? So what I'm saying is that, look, if you're going around in circles, you're still digging in the various traditions. Hey, why not dig in a different well? Why not the Confucian well? Why not the Buddhist well? Why not the Hindu well, for that matter? You know, it just so happens that I work on Confucianism. Well, I thank you again.
Tonight for this very wonderful talk here. And as you know that HSRT is a new program at the university, and so I'm trying to advertise it. And so if you did not have a brochure describing the program, there are a bunch of copies on the back and the table, so please pick one up. And also tomorrow night there is a movie showing, and Saturday there is a Chinese New Year party. For the Chinese New Year party, you have to RSVP to Trustler at Scranton.com. And then Sunday we have another movie public screening. So you can find the place and the time for various events continue to Sunday on Royal News. Just look for the celebration of Chinese New Year series. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good evening.